Welcome back to an introduction to WordPress plugin development. In this lesson, we're going to begin working on our plugin called Post Notice, which is responsible for displaying a post above the post content on WordPress-based blogs. Now, the first thing that we need to do is to hop into our IDE. So let's go ahead and launch it now. I'll be using Coda throughout the remainder of this course. You feel free to use whatever IDE you're most comfortable with. Once I've loaded my IDE, I'm going to navigate to the WP content directory, and then I'm going to navigate to the plugins directory. After that, I'm going to create a directory out of which my plugin file will reside named post-notice. From there, I'll drill down into the subdirectory, and I will go ahead and create a new file for the plugin called postnotice.php. Here, it's important to note that you can technically name a file whatever it is that you want to name it, but it's a good practice to name the file the same name as the directory that it's contained and the name of the plugin as well. So after that, let's go ahead and open up our plugin. Since we haven't written any code, we have a blank file. The first thing that we need to do goes all the way back to several lessons ago. Specifically, we need to set up the code comment that's responsible for having our plugin display in the WordPress dashboard. So let's go ahead and do that now. We'll start off by specifying the plugin name, which is going to be called Post Notice. Next, we'll specify the plugin URI. I don't really have a homepage for this particular plugin, so I'm going to just simply link to my blog. After that, we'll specify the description. Here, we'll simply provide a small sentence that says display a short notice above the post content. We'll start off with version 0.1.0 since this is the first version of the plugin. And as we continue throughout development, we'll be incrementing this so that we'll have snapshots or so that we'll have an idea as to what features were added when as we worked on this plugin. Next, we need to specify the author. Here you simply specify your name or whatever name you'd like to appear in the WordPress dashboard. After that, we'll specify the author URI. I'm going to use the same URL that I provided in the plugin, specifically a link to my blog. Finally, I'm going to specify the license tag, and I'm going to be licensing this plugin under GPL 2.0 or greater. So at this point, let's save our work, and let's launch our web browser. Then navigate to the WordPress dashboard. From here, click on Plugins and go to Installed Plugins. And assuming that you've saved your plugin correctly and structured everything right, you should see Post Notice appear in the list of installed plugins. Notice that it's not activated, but it shows everything that we've specified: the name, the description, the version, the author name, which is linked to the URL that we provided. From here, let's see what happens when we click on Activate. Notice that we receive a message that says the plugin's been activated. However, all of the code that we've written is nothing more than a comment. Now notice here that the plugin's been activated. No source code has actually been executed because we don't have any source code to execute. All we have is a comment block that includes the necessary tags to display our plugin in the WordPress dashboard. And there's something else curious that's going on. Specifically, notice here that it says there is a new version of Post Notice available. Version 1.2 details are update now. But how is this possible? We are writing the first version of the plugin. When it comes to WordPress plugin development, there are times where you may be naming a plugin something that someone else has already named. And this is possible because there are thousands upon thousands of WordPress plugins. So we need to come up with a new name for our plugin. And this is really easy. What we can do is return to our IDE. First, we'll rename the plugin directory Tuts Plus Post Notice. We'll update the plugin core file. And then we'll update the name of the plugin. So let's save our work. Return back to the browser, refresh the dashboard. Notice now that you will probably get an error that says that the plugin has been deactivated because the file doesn't exist. Since we've renamed the file, WordPress can't find it anymore. As such, it's going to tell us that it doesn't exist. Next, click on Installed Plugins, and you'll notice here that we still have our Post Notice listed, but now it says Tuts Plus. And then let's try activating it. After that, it says plugin activated, and we do not see an update notice, which means that we have a unique name for a plugin that doesn't exist in the repository. So here, let's return back to the IDE. There's a little bit more code that we can add in order to get started with building this plugin. So the first thing that we want to do is prevent anyone from executing this plugin if the file is accessed directly. To do that, we check for the presence of a constant that WordPress defines called WP_INC. If it's not defined, we use PHP's die statement. This will prevent anyone from directly accessing the file in a browser. This still allows it to function within WordPress, but it's also a good security precaution. Next, we need to actually implement functionality that's going to bring our plugin to life. Now, in order to do that, we'll be creating a few different files. We'll start off with a class, and we'll call it class tuts+postnotice.php. So in following with good WordPress coding standards, we're going to be naming the file class-tuts+-post-notice.php. We're not ready to edit it just yet. Instead, what we want to do in the file that we're working on is to include it. We'll be doing this using PHP's require statement. Here, we're going to be requiring the class tuts+postNotice. We will be using a WordPress function called plugin dir path, and we will be using it relative to the directory that we are in, which is available through a constant called file in PHP. Let's save our work, return to the browser, and refresh the page. Assuming that the file exists and everything checks out, we should not see any errors here in the dashboard. Next, as we've talked about the features that we're going to be implemented, we know that we're going to be using some CSS, and we're also going to be using some JavaScript to provide a preview of what the message will look like in the post dashboard. So let's go ahead and create a subdirectory out of which we will host our JavaScript files and our CSS files. I'm naming mine assets. And then within the assets directory, I'm going to create a directory for JS. I'm going to create a directory for CSS. I also know that I'm going to have JavaScript performing in the dashboard. So I'm going to go ahead and create a file called admin.js. I also know that I'm going to have CSS running in both the dashboard and on the public facing functionality of the site. So I'm going to create a file called admin.css. And then I'm going to create a file called public.css. Each of these represents the dashboard styles and the public facing styles. Now, before we go any further, we're going to be implementing some code within the tuts+postnotice class. Since we're going to be using object-oriented programming, we need to talk about how we're going to organize the class in order to display the meta box, in order to handle saving of the information, retrieval of the information, sanitization of the information, and all of the other considerations that we took into account in the previous lesson. And because that's a larger topic to cover, we're going to be looking at it starting in the next lesson. So we've begun making progress on our plugin. We've got something in the dashboard, we've got some files stubbed out and created, and we're getting ready to bring our plugin to life. And we'll continue to do so in the next lesson. So please review everything that we've done here, implement it on your local machine, and then we'll continue in the next lesson. Hey everyone, we're in the middle of implementing a plugin for the course, An Introduction to WordPress Plugin Development. At this point, we've stubbed out the plugin, we've got something displaying in the dashboard, and we've provided a few files that we will be filling out throughout the rest of the course. So let's go ahead and resume work where we left off. Open your IDE, navigate to the plugins directory, the tuts+postnotice directory, and open up the core plugin file. Now, at this point, let's open up class tuts+postnotice, and let's begin implementing the basic structure of this class. The first thing to take into account is that we will be using object-oriented programming, so we're going to define our first class. This class needs to match the name of the file that we've provided, so we're going to call it class tuts+postnotice. Earlier in this course, we covered the concept of WordPress hooks, and we're going to be taking advantage of them now. So the first thing that we want to do is to define a function called initialize. We know that it needs to be public because it's going to be accessed by another file, which we'll take a look at momentarily. Specifically, what we're going to do is to incorporate the dashboard CSS file. So let's do that now. First, notice that we've made a call to add action, which is the function provided by WordPress. We're going to be using a hook called admin scripts, which can be used to register both scripts and styles in the WordPress dashboard. Next, we're going to be referring to a function that lives on an instance of this class. Hence, this is why we're using an array. The first part of the array refers to this or this specific class instance, and the second part of the array refers to the name of the function in the class, that is enqueue scripts. Okay, the first thing to notice is that we've made a call to add action, which is the function provided by WordPress, and the first parameter we're using is the name of the hook. In this case, we're using admin enqueue scripts, which can be used to load both scripts and style sheets. The second parameter, rather than just a function name, is an array. The first index of the array is the keyword this, which refers to an instance of this class. The next index of the array is a string called enqueueStyles. This refers to the function that we've defined later in the class called enqueueStyles. And this instructs WordPress that when the admin enqueue scripts hook fires to call the function enqueueStyles on the current instance of this particular plugin. At this point, let's implement the code that's necessary to enqueue the style sheet. Specifically, we're going to be adding the admin.css file. Now I'm going to be using a function that WordPress provides. You can find more information about this function in the WordPress Codex. However, in order to save time and in order to continue to make progress on our plugin at a reasonable rate, I'm going to jump right in. Okay, now that I've defined the function, notice that the first function call is to WP-enqueue style. This is a function provided by WordPress. The first parameter is a unique ID that will refer to this file. The second is the path or the URL to this file as related to this plugin's URL. The third parameter is an empty array. It's normally used to define the dependencies for this file. However, there are none, so we're just passing an empty array. And then the fourth parameter is the version of this plugin. So here we've passed in 0.1.0. Next, let's save our work. Now let's return to our browser and refresh the page. Let's open up the source code for this page by viewing the page source. In Chrome, you can do this on a Mac by pressing Option Command U. And then let's look for admin.css. Notice that it's not found. If we return back to our IDE, we'll see that although we've provided source code here and we've defined a class, it's not actually being called. Under the require once line, let's define a function that will be responsible for instantiating the class we've created and calling the initialize method. Okay, here we've defined a function that says touch plus post notice start. Then we're getting an instance of the post notice, and then we're calling initialize. Finally, when this file is executed, it will make a call to the function that we just named and then execute the plugin. Let's save our work and return to the browser. You can refresh both pages if you'd like. Refresh the source code for the page that we're looking at. Now I'll do another search for admin.css. You'll notice that somewhere early in the document, for me it's line, as you can see, 28, there will be a reference to admin.css. It'll include the version name of the plugin, and it'll include the version of the plugin. There's the unique ID that we've defined, touch plus post notice admin CSS. The suffix CSS is provided by WordPress, and it refers to the file that we've created in our subdirectory. We'll be implementing this later in the course. Let's return back to the IDE and then return back to the touch plus post notice class. Later in this course, we'll enqueue this style on the post dashboard only. We don't want the browser to make any more additional requests than it needs to, and we don't want WordPress to have to serve up any additional requests either. But for now, this is functional enough. We're also going to be enqueuing JavaScript in the dashboard as well. So let's go ahead and define a function and hook it to WordPress so that we can add those JavaScript files to the dashboard. So here, the first thing we want to do is to add another action. We'll hook it to the admin enqueue scripts action, and then we'll hook that to the function enqueue scripts here in this class. Now that we've gone ahead and defined a function, we can go ahead and make a call to WP enqueue script. This is very similar to WP enqueue style, except it's for registering JavaScript files. All right, here, notice that we're making a call to WP enqueue script. We're giving it a unique ID, which is touch plus post notice admin. Notice here that this will have the suffix of JS since this is JavaScript rather than a CSS file. And then we're referring to the admin.js file and the JS subdirectory of the assets directory of where the plugin lives. This file does have a dependency and it depends on jQuery, so we've defined that as the third parameter. And we're able to do that by specifying the ID of jQuery because WordPress bundles this particular library with WordPress core. After that, we specify the version of this plugin, which is currently at 0.1.0. Let's hop over into the admin.js. As you can see here, I have some boilerplate code. This sets up the document ready function, and the function that contains the document ready handler will be fired when this function is loaded. So to test that this file is loaded correctly, let's just add a simple alert message that will fire whenever the page loads. Let's save our work, return to the browser, and refresh the page. Assuming that you've implemented the JavaScript correctly and the script is loaded and enqueued correctly, you should see the loaded dialog appear here. Go ahead and click OK to dismiss it, and we'll return to our IDE. We'll remove the loaded message, and we'll return back to the Touch Plus class. At this point, we actually have a functional plugin. We've got a class that's instantiated, it's initialized, and it registers an admin style sheet and an admin script. We also know that the files are being loaded correctly because we've seen them in the page source, and we've even run some demo JavaScript code. In the next lesson, we'll begin actually implementing the meta box on the post dashboard. In order to do this, we'll create a new class that contains all of the functionality necessary to display the meta box. And after that, we'll then move into actually saving the information. So we're making headway, but we still have a little ways to go. I'm excited about the progress that we've made, and I'm looking forward to continuing adding functionality to our plugin. So I'll see you in the next lesson. Hey everyone, welcome back to an introduction to WordPress plugin development. Right now, we are in the middle of building our plugin. So far, we've set up the basic structure of our plugin, and we've even loaded some JavaScript and CSS. But now it's time to actually begin adding an interface with which our users can interact. So let's pick up right where we left off. First, let's hop into our IDE. Next, navigate to the Touch Plus Post Notice directory if you're not already there, and let's prepare to add a new file. Specifically, we're going to be adding a file that's responsible for rendering the post metadata. So let's do that now. We will call it class Touch Plus Post Notice Editor.php. Next, let's go ahead and open up the file and provide the basic class definition exactly as we did with the Post Notice class. Before we go any further, we need to remember to return to the bootstrap file and to require this file as well. This file should be required before the Touch Plus Notice file because it's a dependency, as we'll see in just a little bit. But for now, return to the post editor. The first thing that we want to do is provide an initialize method exactly like we did with the Touch Plus Notice class. At this point, before we go any further, let's go ahead and instantiate this class and call its initialize function to make sure that we have all of our files properly loaded and the classes are being instantiated and initialized properly. Return to the bootstrap file. And then in the Touch Plus Notice Start function, we'll say Post Notice Editor. Next, we'll create a variable called Post Editor, and we'll use it to store a reference to the Touch Plus Post Notice Editor. Next, we'll pass the variable into the constructor for Touch Plus Post Notice. And at this point, we need to actually hop into the Touch Plus Post Notice class and define a constructor. The constructor should accept a single parameter, which will be a reference to the editor, and then it will call editor initialize. Let's save our work here. Return to the browser, and refresh the plugins page. The first thing we want to do is to create a directory called views. After that, we want to create a file called Touch Plus Post Notice Editor.php. For now, this file will only contain a basic HTML tag for a text area. Now let's return to class Touch Plus Post Notice Editor.php. In the function body, we'll be requiring a single file. We'll make a call to plugin dir path with respect to where this file is located, and we'll specify views/touch plus post notice editor.php. We'll save our work and return to the browser. We'll refresh, and then we'll scroll down to our meta box. The text area is displaying. That's great. That means that the file that we've created is being properly required by the editor class, and it's being displayed here in the UI. Now let's return back to our IDE. One point that I'd like to make here is that you often will see in WordPress plugins a mix of HTML, CSS, possibly JavaScript, and PHP all in a single file. I like to try to segment my files a little bit more than that, which is why I created a views directory. That views directory will be responsible for housing the HTML or the markup that is going to be used to display the UI for the meta box. So that will keep this particular function, that is post notice display, lean. It will require a single line to include it. And then the editor will be the editor file will be responsible for displaying the markup. There will be a little bit of PHP located in this file, but the most of it will be HTML. Next, let's give this text area a name attribute. And then after that, let's go ahead and open up the admin.css file. Here, we'll reference the text area we just created using the name attribute, and we'll set its width equal to 100%. This way, it will fill out the meta box in which it's located. We've already enqueued this file in the plugin, so we should be able to return to the dashboard, refresh the page, and see it expand to 100% width of the meta box. Let's scroll down, and there's the text area. However, we still have work to do. The next thing we want is to be able to save the information that's related to this meta box. In order to do that, we need to take into account two things. One are security measures, and two are permissions. The first thing that we need to do is to set up a handler for the save post functionality. This will allow us to save this information to the post metadata. To do that, let's return back to the IDE, and then let's return to class Touch Plus Post Notice Editor.php. In the initialize function, we'll add a new action. In the initialize function, we'll use the add action function to define a new hook. We'll define a reference to a function called save post notice because then it will be saving the data in the post notice. Next, we'll define the function. We'll also make sure that it accepts a post ID because that's what WordPress will pass this function when it's invoked, and this will allow us to save the metadata or the contents of the text area associated with this post. But before we actually do that, we need to make sure that the user has permission to save. So let's set up a conditional that will check to see if the user has permission. All right, in this function, there's a few things that we want to check. First, we want to see if the post is being auto-saved by WordPress. This is a functionality that WordPress provides that allows us, while we're writing, to have our drafts periodically updated. Check if the post is automatically being saved. We'll make a call to WP is post autosave, and we'll pass in the post ID. Next, we need to check to see if this is a post revision. We will do this very similar to how we did for the autosave. We define a variable called isRevision. We make a call to WP is post revision and pass in the post ID. After that, we'll return. This return statement checks to see if it's an autosave or a revision, and if it's not, it will return true. This means the user has permission to save. Next, we'll return to the save post notice function. Here, we'll check to see if there is content that we need to save. If there is, we will save it to the post metadata using the WordPress post meta API. And if there's not, we'll delete existing information. Here, we'll use the WordPress post meta API to save the information to the database. At this point, we're ready to take our first pass at saving the information to the database. To do this, we'll read the content of the meta box into a variable, and then we'll save it to the database using the WordPress post meta API. Here's how to do that. We define a variable called post notice. After that, we make a reference to the PHP post collection, and we use the index of tuts plus post notice editor. That's the name of the text area that we defined in the view. After that, we make a call to update post meta, and we provide 3 parameters. The first parameter is the post ID with which this data is associated. The second is a meta key, which is how we can uniquely identify this information with this post. And the third parameter is the content to be associated, or the meta value that's to be associated with this post metadata. Next, let's return to the view. Here, we need to make one call to the WordPress post metadata API in order to retrieve the data that we've just saved. We do that by saying get post meta, and then we use a function called get the ID to get the current post ID. We use the meta key that we define, which is the tuts plus post notice. And the third parameter says true, that we want to return the data as a string. Remember to include the echo statement so that we are able to echo this information into the context of the text area. Save your view, and then return to your browser. Here, I'm at the All Posts screen. I'm going to click on Edit World. And I'll scroll down to the post notice, and I'll say, this is a sample message. I will update the value. And if everything's worked correctly, I should be able to scroll down and see the message that I just saved in the text area. And there it is. Now let's try deleting the message. Let's try one more thing. Next, let's put in an HTML tag and say, hey, is this saving HTML? And we'll see if it's allowing us to save HTML to the database. Scroll back up and click Update. Scroll down and notice that it is allowing us to save HTML tags to the database. At this point, we've got a functional UI, we're saving information to the database, and we're retrieving it. The problem is that we're not fully taking advantage of the permissions or the security measures that are offered by WordPress and PHP. So in the next lesson, we'll tighten things up, we'll make things a little more secure, and then we'll continue working on our plugin. Welcome back to an introduction to WordPress plugin development. We are deep in the weeds of building our first WordPress plugin. So far, we've created the plugin, we've added JavaScript and CSS to the dashboard, and we've also began creating our meta box that allows us to save data and retrieve data from the database. However, we noticed at the end of the last lesson that our code isn't as secure as it should be. That is, it's not fully checking for permissions, and it's allowing us to save information to the database that it shouldn't. Namely, it's allowing us to save HTML tags and other characters. So the next thing that we want to do is to hop into our IDE and begin implementing the security measures to prevent this from happening. So let's do that now. The first thing that we want to do is to sanitize the information that's being written to the database. So the first thing that we'll do is hop into the class tuts plus post notice editor. We'll scroll down. Now, before we save the information to the post metadata using the update post meta function, we want to sanitize the data. Since we have it saved in the post notice, or since we have it referenced in the post notice variable, we can do the following. First, we'll make a call to strip tags. This will remove all HTML and PHP tags from a string. And this will then return the string without those tags. After that, we can make a call to strip slashes, which will unquote a quoted string. And then we'll save the result to post notice. After that, we'll make our call to update post meta. So let's return back to the browser and scroll down. Notice that we have HTML that's located here. Let's try updating it again. Click on Update and scroll down. And notice now that the HTML has been removed. Let's try to provide, say, some JavaScript and see what happens. Okay, we're simply specifying a script tag, then we're adding an alert box. All that should be left is the alert loaded message. Let's update it. Scroll down, and we notice that all that we have is alert loaded. That's great. It's being sanitized and saved to the database. Now, we are cleaning up the information and saving it. However, we still need to do some work with respect to permissions. WordPress has what's called a nonce, which is short for a number used once, and it's used to help protect URLs and forms from being misused or from malicious conduct or anything like that. It's basically a security measure that verifies that the information that's coming from one source is valid to be saved to the database. And since we're working with a form, namely our text area, we need to set up a nonce value and then verify it on the server side before saving our information. Luckily, there's a complete API that's available for this. Let's return to our IDE, and then let's load the view. Next, we'll open up enclosing PHP tags, and then let's make a call to WP nonce field. The first parameter that will pass it will be the action name. Since we're saving our post notice data, let's call it tuts plus post notice save. After that, we need to give the nonce a name. We can call this tuts plus post notice nonce. Okay, at this point, we now need to return to the save post function the save post hook that we've defined and then verify the nonce. But recall, we've defined a function user can save. So we'll hop down into that function, and this is what will actually do the verification for the nonce. Okay, the first thing that we want to do is make sure that our nonce value is actually set in the PHP post collection. Next, we want to use the WordPress API to verify that the nonce coming from the browser is the same one that was sent to it. First, add the and then make a call to WP verify nonce. After that, we'll pass in the value of the post collection's tuts plus post notice nonce and the name of the action, which is tuts plus post notice save. We'll save the result of this conditional into a variable is valid nonce. And then we'll update the return statement so that it not only checks for autosave and revision, but it also checks to see if this is a valid nonce. We'll save our work. And this is all that should be necessary. So let's return to the browser, scroll down, and then let's say this is a sample message. We'll update the post, and if all things are correct, then we should be able to scroll down and see the message that we just saved. Great. We've now secured the form. At this point, we've completed our meta box. We have defined it. We have styled it, we have set the permissions, and we are sanitizing the data. So before we move on to the next point, let's hop over to the Bootstrap file and change the version of the plugin to 0.2.0. Next, move to the post notice class and change the version of the plugin where it's enqueuing the scripts and the styles. And while we're here, let's also take this opportunity to make sure that we're only registering these styles and scripts on the post page. We can do this using a function called getCurrentScreen. We'll store the value of the getCurrentScreen function in a variable called screen, and then we'll check its ID property. The ID property should tell us if we're on a post or not. We'll say if the post is not equal to the screen ID, then we'll exit the function. Otherwise, we'll enqueue the style. Let's do the same exact thing to the script function. Now let's return to our browser and scroll down. Assuming that everything's loaded correctly, our text area should continue to fill 100% width of the meta box. This ensures that the style sheet is being enqueued on this page. Now, we're almost done with the meta box. The last thing that we need to do is to provide a preview area in the meta box that allows us to see what the notice is going to look like on the public-facing side of the blog. So in the next lesson, we'll actually implement that functionality. We're nearing the end of developing our plugin, so I can't wait to implement the functionality over the next couple of lessons, and I will see you there. Welcome back to an introduction to WordPress plugin development. We're almost done with the administrative side of our plugin. In this lesson, we're going to pick up exactly where we left off in the last lesson that allows us to dynamically see what the user will see on the public-facing side of the site. We're going to go ahead and get started by hopping into our IDE. Next, we're going to open up the view, which will be the tuts plus post notice editor.php file. Above the text editor, let's create a div element that will be responsible for showing the preview. Initially, the div is just going to be an empty element. We'll use JavaScript to read the content of the text area as it changes, and then we'll use that to update the content of the div. So let's go ahead and hop into the admin.js file. The file's already been stubbed out, so we need to hop into the document ready handler and begin adding the following code. The first thing that we want to do is set up variables that will reference both the preview element and the editor element. Since these will be jQuery wrapped objects, we are going to prefix the variables with the $sign. Next, as soon as the page loads, we want to populate the preview pane with the content of the text editor. We can do that by saying preview.html and setting that value equal to editor.text. So let's save our work and return back to the browser. If we pick up exactly where we left off, then we'll be on the Hello World edit screen. We'll scroll down and we'll see a text area that says this is a sample message. It's just the text area right now, so let's update the post. And when the page refreshes, we should be able to scroll down and see the value of the text message here in the div element, which we've defined. And it looks really plain right now as it's not styled. And we'll get to that a little bit later in the course. But what we need to do now is to be able to update the content of the div element with the content of the text area while we're typing. So as we say, this is a sample message in the editor, as we make modifications to that, it should also show up in the preview area or the div element that we've created. And as you can see right now, it will only do so on the page refresh. So let's return to the IDE and let's hop into admin.js. We can do this using a similar line of code to what we have above. But rather than using editor.text to populate the preview.html, we'll be using editor.val. Secondly, rather than using the editor variable, we're going to be using a jQuery wrapped version of the this keyword. This refers to the element that is causing the event or triggering the event. And in our case, that's the text area or the editor. So let's save our work and return to the browser. Once the page refreshes, we'll scroll down to the meta box. We'll begin clearing out the editor and notice that the preview area reflects the changes that we're making as we're typing. So we can continue to type and to see a preview of what the text will look like. Not bad, right? We'll update the text and notice that it stays the same. So what we'll do now is return to the IDE. And let's open up admin.css. We want to make sure that the preview in the dashboard looks exactly the same as it does on the public-facing view. So we are going to be using the same styles. Of course, the styles will be targeting a different element since we're in the dashboard. In order to take advantage of this, we'll go ahead and set up a selector for our div. Once that's done, we'll add the following styles. Okay, we've added a number of different styles starting with the background color. We've also updated the border, which is similar to the shade of the background for the preview. And we're also setting a border radius that is cross-browser compatible. We're also setting margin and padding. After that, we're setting the font color, the text shadow, the font family, and the font size. These are all styles that you can choose as you wish, or you can choose to implement your own styles. This is what I'm sticking with for this lesson, and it's what will be included in the source code of this plugin. And this is also what we're going to see happening on the front end. So let's hop over to the browser and refresh the page. This way we'll be loading the new styles. Once done, we can scroll down to the bottom and notice that the preview looks much nicer. Notice that we still indicate to the user that the preview area is there by having the yellow area, even if no text is present in the editor. Now at this point, we're ready to begin work on the front end of our plugin. In the next lesson, we're going to round out the development of our plugin. In order to do this, we need to make sure that we display the post notice on the front end of the blog. And we need to also make sure that we're properly loading the styles so that the styles for the message are properly displayed. We're almost done with writing the code for the plugin. I can't wait to see you in the next lesson as we begin to finish up the functionality of our plugin. Welcome back to an introduction to WordPress plugin development. At this point, we have completely finished the dashboard components of our plugin and we're ready to begin work on the public-facing side of our plugin. Luckily, we've already covered everything that we need to know in order to get ourselves up and running quickly with this. Specifically, we need to be able to filter the content using a hook, and we need to be able to enqueue a public style. So let's pick up where we left off. Let's return to our IDE And let's add a new file to the root of the plugin directory. We'll call it class tuts plus post notice display. The first thing that we want to do is open a PHP tag. Next, we want to provide a class definition. Next, we want to return to the bootstrap file for this plugin and make sure that we require the newly added file. This will allow us to instantiate the plugin based on whether or not we're looking at the dashboard or the public-facing side of the blog. Luckily, WordPress has a function that makes it really easy to determine which part of the application we're looking at. That is, we can either determine if we're looking at the dashboard or the public-facing side of the site. This function is called isAdmin, and it works like this. First, we make a call to isAdmin, and it will return a Boolean. And what we'll say is if we're in the dashboard, then we will instantiate the post editor, and then we'll pass it to an instance of the post notice class, and then we'll initialize it. If we're on the public-facing side of the site, we'll do something else. First, we'll instantiate the tuts plus post notice display class that we've just created, and then we'll call the initialize method on it. Notice here, in the body of the conditional, we have two lines of code that are the same. Since we're using the same variable name and the same method name, we can pull it out of the body of the conditional and call it only once. However, before we begin testing this, we need to actually hop back into our display class and implement this function. Now we'll save our work and return to the browser. At this point, we can take a look at the Hello World post and take a look at it in the public-facing side of the site. Notice that we don't actually see anything, but the blog does function as normal. This is a good thing. Let's return to the IDE. Now the first thing that we want to do here is to add a filter that will pre-pin the post notice to the post content. First, we'll add a filter. We're going to hook on to the content filter, and then we're going to use our own function called display notice. Remember that we have to pass in an array that uses a reference to this, referring to this class, and a function name called display notice. Let's define that function now. Here, we've defined the function. Notice that unlike some of our other hooked functions, this particular function takes in a parameter, specifically the content. WordPress will hand us the content and allow us to modify it or process it before returning it back to WordPress for displaying in the browser. So the first thing that we want to be able to do is to retrieve the post metadata exactly like we do on the post dashboard. To do this, we'll make a call to get post meta, and we'll use a function called getTheID to get the current post ID. We'll use the meta key tuts plus notice, and remember we'll pass the third parameter as true because we want it returned as a string. So we'll refer to that in the notice variable. Next, we only want to prepin the notice to the content if the notice is not an empty string. So the first thing that we do is to set up a conditional that says if an empty string is not equal to notice, then we'll define some basic HTML. First, we start a div with the ID of tuts plus post notice. Then we append the content of the post metadata. This belongs in the div element. Finally, we close the div. All that's left now is to prepend it to the content. At this point, we should be able to save our work and then view our blog and see the notice at the top of the post. Notice here that we actually do see the post notice, however, it is not styled. So what we need to do is to hop back into our editor, and then we need to add a function that will enqueue the public-facing style sheet exactly like we did in the dashboard. So we'll start by adding an action to WP enqueue scripts, which will allow us to enqueue scripts for the public-facing side of the site. Next, we'll pass in an array that refers to an instance of this class, and the name of the function will be enqueueStyles. Let's define the function for enqueueStyles now. This is going to work almost exactly as it does in the dashboard. We're going to make a call to WP enqueueStyle. Notice here, though, that there are a few small differences. First, notice that the ID that we're passing in is tuts plus post notice. This does not have the admin suffix, so it allows us to differentiate between what's being displayed in the dashboard and what's being displayed on the public-facing side of the site. Next, make sure to enqueue the public.css file rather than any of the other style sheets. There are no dependencies, so we can pass an empty array, and the version that we have will declare as 1.0.0. Before we're done, we'll go ahead and update this in other places throughout the code as we're rounding out the development of this plugin. Before we reload the page, let's actually add the styles to the public.css file. Since we're going to be using the same exact styles that we use in the dashboard, supply those same files to public.css, but update the selector so that it references tuts plus post notice, as that's the name of the div that appears on the public-facing side of the blog. At this point, let's save all of our work and return to the browser. Let's refresh the page and notice that we have the post notice, but the post content is being styled as well. This is a small bug that's happening in the filter function. So let's return back to our code and then return to the touch plus post notice display. And let's take a look at exactly what's going wrong. And in the first line, we're trying to append some text to notice.html before that variable has even been declared. Now we're properly closing off the div. And what we want to do instead is make sure that we're starting a string here. These are common problems that you're likely to stumble across when working in WordPress development, so it's important to see them so that you know how to debug them manually or even with a debugger, but a debugger is outside the scope of this lesson. Let's save our work and refresh the blog. When the page refreshes, you should be able to see the post notice exactly as it appears in the dashboard, and then you should also be able to see the post content as normal. Now let's return to the home page, and you'll also see the post notice here. This is great. We've completed our plugin. The last thing that we need to do is to go through and change the places where we have the version so that it reflects the proper final version of our plugin. So we'll update the doc block to 1.0.0, and then we'll update all of the references in WP&Q style, WP&Q script to 1.0.0. Now we have a fully developed and working WordPress plugin. We've talked about a number of different things throughout this course, and we'll be taking a look at them and some additional things that you can do to prepare your plugin for distribution after development starting in the next lesson. I've really enjoyed building this plugin. I hope you've learned a lot, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.